What is your full name, sir?
Stephen Melnikoff.
Where and when were you born?
I was born in Woonsocket, Rhode Island on November 28, 1919.
So how old are you right now?
I'm 97.
Do you feel like you're 97?
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I actually feel much younger than 97.
Physically, how old do you feel?
Oh, maybe 10 or 15 years younger than that.
Well, tell me about some of the things that you still do at 97.
Well, at 97, I live alone. I take care of my little property here, cut the grass. I have plants that I take care of, that I love plants, and take care of my property. I play golf 3 times a week. I play 18 holes on Tuesdays, Thursday, and Saturday, if the weather is permitting, and even sometimes in winter if the temperature's comfortable enough.
What branch of the military were you in during World War II?
I was in the infantry.
What division, regiment, and company were you in, sir?
I was in C Company, 175th Regiment, 29th Division.
And what was your specific role in Company C?
Well, I started as a private, and my role with C Company was as an assistant BAR man.
Meaning what?
Meaning that I was the ammunition carrier and with the Browning automatic rifleman in a third squad of the 3rd platoon of C Company.
And what was the highest rank you achieved by the time you left the armed services?
When I left the armed services, I was a tech sergeant. But I was actually, when it was time for me to go home, I was the acting first sergeant of Company C.
And you mentioned you were born in Rhode Island. Did you grow up there?
Yes, I grew up and was raised, went to school in Rhode Island, graduated from Sauget High School, 1937, and worked there a while.
Talk to me about growing up in Rhode Island. What kind of things would you do for fun as a child?
As a child, I had a very, very good early time. We played. I played all the sports. We swam. We played football, baseball, basketball. We did everything normal kids did, and I would say that I had a very good and wholesome childhood.
What was your father's profession?
My father was a weaver in a woolen worsted mill, and eventually came to be a mechanic there, and his title was actually a loom fixer, but he took care of the machines that wove the cloth.
Did he have a job during the Depression?
Yes, that was his job during Depression, and probably during Depression there was times when he didn't work, but yes, that's what his job was.
Talk to me about the struggles that your family faced during the Great Depression.
During the Depression, I think we were like the rest of the people. Many of the industries went broke. Like I can remember in my town was a big cotton and worsted producing area, because Rhode Island had a lot of cotton mills and worsted mills, and because all the business were going broke, they just laid the people off, and the people had no work. But I will tell you this: my dad was a very proud man, and I will say this, that it was never a time that we didn't have something to eat. Maybe it was kind of thin, but I don't ever want any people to feel sorry for me because of the Depression, because my father and mother were great providers. My father was a very smart man. He was, I think he had some money, and he was even too proud to take any help from the government.
But when you see what the kids today have growing up, compare that with what you had as a child.
Well, as a child, I think pretty much I had everything I needed. In other words, my folks they provided us with clothes. My father was very sure and insisted on getting the best food all the time. And my father was quite a smart man, even though he didn't have much education. And I idolized my father. He was a great man.
Talk to me about some of the things that you guys didn't have growing up back then.
Oh, let me say this. Growing up, there was no telephone in my home, no in the home of the area where the people I lived, because we were people that were not, well, we were not poor, but we were the working people. My father, mother, and all of my friends, their fathers worked in the mills, so we had no telephone. I'm sure the rich people had phones. We had cold water flats. We had no hot water in our homes. We had no, because television didn't come in till the 1940s, so we didn't have any of that. I can still remember when my mother would light up the gas lamp when I first was a child. I don't know how old I was, but I was probably 5 or 6 years old, but I can still remember that. There was no cars, nobody in the area, in our kind of level of of I don't know what you want to call it, but in our level of people that we didn't have even a bicycle. I can remember the only fellow in our neighborhood that had a bicycle. He was a newspaper boy, and he saved his pennies from peddling newspaper, and so he got a. So this is what it was. There was no telephone. There was no radio. Actually, I can remember going to my uncle's because he had a crystal radio. People now wouldn't even have a clue what that meant. But there was none of those conveniences.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I had one sister, and I understand that there was another child born to my mother, but the child died during the influenza epidemics that were happening in the 1910s, whatever it was, 15s, yes.
So you were the only one from your family to go overseas during the war?
Yes, I was the only boy, and I went overseas.
What high school did you go to?
I went to Woonsocket High School and graduated in 1937.
How did you hear about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
I'm not sure that I can remember exactly how, but we probably heard of it in a newspaper or somebody that had a radio at the time, because they were just beginning to have radios, and somebody then probably passed the word around.
What was that like to hear that your country had been attacked?
Well, I think it was quite appalling to everybody, and everybody was just in shock to think that was something like that would happen. And it was an immediate, lot of people volunteered to the services and stuff like that. But I was working at the time in a shipyard in Quincy, Mass, so it didn't affect me at the time, but I was very cognizant of everything that was going on. I think I was a person who was interested in civic stuff, and so I knew what was going on.
So take me through how you ended up in the service.
I wound up in the service because I was registered in the draft board in Quincy, Massachusetts, because that's where I was working in the shipyard. And so I did have an early number. It was a raffle kind of thing, and I had an early number, but because I was working in the shipyard on heavy naval vessels, I worked on the USS Massachusetts, I worked on the USS Quincy and other heavy cruisers, and I worked on various aircraft carriers. And so because of that, I received 3 deferments. And so there was quite a while. Even after I was put in 1A, after my 3rd deferment was up, they still didn't call me up for a while. And eventually I was drafted.
So once you were drafted, where did they send you?
I was drafted, and my first place, the induction center that I went to, was Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And and that was in 1943.
And just take me through your training and how you get overseas.
Well, what happened is, I'll just say briefly tell someone what happened here that was on the sideline. Because I was physically very fit. Eyesight was 20/15. And I could pass the mental test. They wanted me to go, go into the Air Force. But after I passed the medical test at Fort Devens, they sent me to Grenier Field, New Hampshire to take the flight surgeon physical. But while there, I could not pass the depth perception test, and they sent me back to Fort Devens, and then for the next week, they sent me back up, and I still couldn't pass the test. The third time I went up the following week, they decided that I would not be able to be a pilot. So because my depth perception was bad, and the doctor told me if I was tired, came in for a landing, I would miss, overshoot, undershoot the field. So they went back to Fort Devens, and then within a few days, I was assigned to the infantry.
Is that the first place you wanted to go, the infantry?
I don't think the Army worked that way. The Army just decided. I doubt if there was any very good plan. If they needed infantrymen, we became infantrymen. If they needed artillery, we became artillery. I don't really know the workings of it, but I don't think it was that sophisticated a thing. What was there, if you were there and they needed 1,000 men, well, the next 1,000 men would become infantrymen. I think that's the way it probably worked.
So, you get sent to the infantry, and then what happens?
We were put on trains, and that was a mode of transportation, and in 2 days it took on trains, just a regular passenger trains. We wound up in Texas at Camp Fannin. It was a new camp for training combat infantrymen. Prior to this, the infantrymen received 12 weeks of infantry training before going into combat. But because we were going to go into real combat, a new program was set up at this training center, and we had 17 weeks of very hard infantry training. We fired every weapon available to the infantry. We could take it apart, put it back together. We ran, we marched, we used every weapon possible, including bayonet training, of hand-to-hand. We did mortar shooting, machine gun. We did the whole thing for 17 weeks, and then at the end of 17 weeks, we were assigned.
And where were you assigned?
We were sent to, I was sent actually to Fort Meade, and from there we were given a furlough. I think it was probably 7 days, and when we came back, we were sent from there to Camp Shanks up on the Hudson River, waiting for a shipload to go overseas.
And then?
Well, then, actually, we were there for about 21 days waiting because we were going to be loaded on the Ile-de-France, and it was a big ship, and it had to, I guess, it loaded about 10,000 GIs. So in 3 weeks, on January 17th, we took off from New York to Scotland, and we zigzagged across the Atlantic because that was the mode of the fast ships, and only the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, and the Ile-de-France were the only ones that were fast enough to do this, because it was a scheme that would fool the submarines, because it took them a certain amount of time to get on target, and by that time we would zigzag, and so we wound up in Greenock, Scotland. Oh, I do want to say we did cross in a nasty northeaster, and we had 10,006 GIs. I wasn't one of them. Spent a lot of time on deck watching the waves go over the top, the bow of this great ship. It was actually the third biggest and fastest ship in the world. And I was not sick, and I've never had to see sick. But so I probably would have made a good sailor, but that was not to be.
So, tell me, are you already assigned to the 29th at this point?
I didn't know that, but I know, I know from analyzing what happened to me and the people with me. So I knew, but not till way after the war when I finally remembered some of the things. Because what happened when we came to Scotland, we didn't stop in Scotland just long enough to get on trains, and we were loaded on different trains, some going to different areas and cities on the southern coast of England. I went to Penzance, others went to I think Plymouth and other places, and my assignment was to the 175th Regiment. So because we never stopped in Scotland at all, we just took enough time to get on the trains. So I knew that when we left the States, I had been assigned to 175th Infantry Regiment. And then we spent a few days in Penzance, and then I was assigned to St. Ives, a seacoast place where C Company and the 1st Battalion were stationed in that area. And that's where we spent the next months in England.